The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Oak Ridge Avenue as Harold Johnson signaled and turned his 20-year-old Buick into the pharmacy parking lot. At 72, Harold moved with the measured patience of someone who had seen enough of life to know that rushing rarely improved matters. His arthritic fingers tapped lightly on the steering wheel as he hummed along to a Motown classic, playing softly on the radio. Harold had just left his weekly physical therapy session for his bad knee, a stubborn reminder of his years of service. 3 more prescriptions to pick up, then home to catch the baseball game. Simple plans for a simple Tuesday. He didn't notice the police cruiser until the flashing lights reflected in his rearview mirror. Harold frowned, mentally retracing his drive from the clinic. He'd been careful as always. Signal at every turn, complete stops 5 miles under the limit. Old habits from decades of military discipline died hard. The cruiser pulled up behind him, lights pulsing against the brick wall of the pharmacy. Harold turned down his radio and reached slowly for the glove compartment where he kept his registration. Officer Mike Reynolds watched the old sedan for a moment before stepping out of his patrol car. 6 years on the force in this small town, and he'd developed what he called a sixth sense for trouble. The car was old but well-maintained, not typically what brought his attention, but something about the driver's body language when he'd passed him a few blocks back. A stiffness, an overcorrection at the 4-way stop, had triggered Reynolds' suspicion. "Afternoon," Reynolds said as he approached, one hand casually resting near his holster, a habit more than a necessity. His sunglasses hid his eyes as he assessed the elderly black man behind the wheel. "License and registration." "Yes, officer," Harold replied, his voice deep and even. His movements were deliberate as he handed over his documents. "May I ask what I did wrong?" Reynolds ignored the question, studying the license. "You're a long way from Pine Street, Mr. Johnson." His tone suggested this was somehow suspicious. "Just coming from physical therapy, sir." "Then stopping for my medication before heading home." Harold gestured toward the pharmacy entrance. Reynolds handed back the license but kept the registration. "You made an illegal turn back at Maple. Crossed the solid line." His voice carried an edge that hadn't been there in the 3 tickets he'd written earlier that day. Harold's brow furrowed. "I don't believe I did, officer. I'm very careful about my driving. That's what they all say." Reynolds' mouth tightened. "People like you think the rules don't apply when no one's watching." The words hung in the air between them. Harold felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Not fear, but the weight of recognition. This wasn't his first encounter with prejudice wearing a badge. "I respect the law, officer," Harold said quietly, his eyes steady. "I always have." A young woman walked out of the pharmacy, slowing as she noticed the scene. She hesitated by her car, keys in hand, watching. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Reynolds said suddenly. "May I ask why that's necessary?" Harold kept his voice level, though his heart rate had picked up. "Because I asked you to," Reynolds said, his tone hardening. "Or is following simple instructions a problem for you?" The woman by her car had taken out her phone now. Harold noticed her from the corner of his eye but kept his attention on the officer. "No problem at all," Harold said, reaching for the door handle with careful movements. "I just have a bad knee, so I'll need to move slowly." "I don't need your life story," Reynolds cut in. "Just get out of the car." Harold eased himself out, grimacing slightly as his knee protested. He was tall, still straight-backed despite his age, wearing pressed khaki slacks and a button-down shirt beneath a light jacket. The same neat appearance he'd maintained every day since leaving the service. "You people always have to make things difficult." "Don't you?" Reynolds muttered, just loud enough for Harold to hear. Harold felt a flicker of anger but tamped it down, the way he had countless times before. "I'm cooperating fully, officer." "Hands where I can see them," Reynolds ordered, despite Harold's hands being plainly visible at his sides. By now, 2 more people had paused to watch. One, an off-duty nurse Harold recognized from the VA hospital, called out, "Is everything okay, Mr. Johnson?" "Everything's fine, Linda," Harold answered calmly. "Just a misunderstanding." Reynolds' head snapped toward the nurse. "Please return to your business, ma'am. This is a police matter." "I know this gentleman," Linda persisted. "He's a regular at the VA. Is there a problem?" Reynolds turned back to Harold, irritation clear in his stance. "Stand against the vehicle, sir." The polite address sounded anything but polite. Harold complied, placing his palms on the warm metal of his car. "Officer, I'd be happy to discuss whatever traffic violation you believe occurred. There's no need for this. There's a need for whatever I decide there's a need for, Reynolds snapped. Do you understand that? Because I'm not sure certain folks around here get that concept. A second police car pulled into the lot. Officer Diane Chen, responding to a call Reynolds had put in for backup before approaching Harold's vehicle. She assessed the situation with a quick glance. Elderly man in neat clothes standing cooperatively against a well-kept older car, small crowd beginning to gather. Everything under control, Reynolds? She asked, approaching cautiously. Just a routine stop, Reynolds replied. Subject was combative. Harold said nothing, but his eyes met Chen's briefly. Something in that steady gaze made her pause. Sir, do you have anything in your pockets I should know about before I pat you down? Reynolds asked, his tone suggesting he expected to find something incriminating. Only my wallet, handkerchief, and house keys, Harold replied, and my medications in my right jacket pocket. I'll determine that, Reynolds said, beginning a pat-down that was more aggressive than necessary. Chen watched with growing discomfort. The combative subject she saw was a senior citizen standing perfectly still, maintaining remarkable composure despite Reynolds' evident hostility. What exactly was the violation, Mike? She asked quietly. Illegal turn crossing a solid line, Reynolds replied without looking at her, and I've got reasonable suspicion there might be more. Based on? Chen pressed. Reynolds just shook his head, continuing his search of Harold's pockets. When he pulled out the wallet, it fell open to reveal Harold's VA ID card. Chen's eyes widened slightly. Sir, are you a veteran? Yes, ma'am, Harold answered. 35 years of service. That doesn't excuse traffic violations, Reynolds cut in, though something in his voice had changed, a note of uncertainty. The small crowd had grown. Among them was Tom Garcia, the owner of the hardware store next to the pharmacy who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He stepped forward. Harold Johnson? What's going on here? Reynolds turned, irritation clear on his face. Sir, please step back. This doesn't concern you. Actually, I think it might, Garcia replied. That's Colonel Johnson you've got there. Served with my father in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken. Harold nodded slightly but remained in position against his car. Reynolds faltered for just a moment. Military service doesn't place anyone above the law. No one's saying it does, Chen interjected, her voice low. But I think we can handle this differently. She turned to Harold. Sir, would you mind explaining exactly what happened before the stop? As Harold began to calmly recount his drive, Reynolds' radio crackled. The dispatcher's voice came through clearly in the now quiet parking lot. Be advised, the vehicle you reported checking? Registered to Harold Johnson. Decorated veteran, no priors, not even a parking ticket in the system. The crowd had grown quiet, watching. Reynolds' face flushed. I think we're done here, Chen said quietly to her colleague. Then louder to Harold. Thank you for your cooperation, sir. You're free to go about your business. Harold straightened up slowly, his knee stiff from standing. Thank you, officer, he said to Chen. Then, looking directly at Reynolds, I hope the rest of your day improves, son. It wasn't said with sarcasm or anger, just the simple dignity of a man who had faced far worse than this moment and emerged with his humanity intact. As Harold finally made his way into the pharmacy, the whispers in the crowd began to spread. Officer Reynolds returned to his cruiser, avoiding the eyes of the onlookers. What he didn't know yet was that 3 different phones had recorded the entire encounter, and by morning, the town of Oak Ridge would be having a very different conversation about what happened in that parking lot on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Word spread quickly through the small pharmacy. Customers leaned around shelves, peering through the front windows at the scene in the parking lot. Behind the counter, head pharmacist Diane Willis put a call on hold. She'd known Harold for over a decade. He never missed his monthly checkup at the VA clinic where her sister worked as a nurse. Give me a minute, she told her assistant, slipping off her white coat. That's Harold Johnson out there. Outside, Officer Chen had stepped back toward her patrol car, discomfort evident on her face. Reynolds remained standing near Harold, who had retrieved his wallet and was carefully putting it back in his pocket. So we're clear, Reynolds said, his voice lower but his stance still aggressive. I'm letting you go with a warning this time. But I've got my eye on you. Harold nodded once. I understand. His voice betrayed nothing but the set of his shoulders spoke volumes. As Harold turned toward the pharmacy entrance, Reynolds added, "And next time someone in uniform gives you an order, you follow it immediately. No questions, no explanations." Harold paused, his back to the officer. The small crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly a dozen people, many with phones discreetly recording. The tension in the air was palpable. Slowly, Harold turned back. "Officer Reynolds, I've been following orders from people in uniform since before you were born. But there's a difference between authority and respect. One is given by position, the other is earned." A murmur ran through the onlookers. Reynolds' face flushed deeper. "Are you threatening an officer of the law?" His hand moved to rest on his holster again, a gesture that wasn't missed by anyone present, including Officer Chen, who straightened up with alarm. "Not at all," Harold replied calmly. "Simply sharing an observation from my experience." "And what experience would that be?" Reynolds' voice dripped with sarcasm. "Driving while breaking traffic laws?" From the edge of the crowd, Tom Garcia stepped forward again. "Mike, you need to back off. You have no idea who you're talking to." "Stay out of this, Garcia," Reynolds snapped, "unless you want to be brought in for interfering with police business." Diane Willis emerged from the pharmacy, her white coat exchanged for a light cardigan. She walked directly to Harold's side. "Harold, your prescription is ready." "Why don't you come inside?" Reynolds stepped between them. "This man isn't going anywhere until I say so." Chen approached quickly. "Reynolds, we've verified his ID. The stop is complete." "There's no reason to detain him further." "I decide when it's complete," Reynolds insisted, his voice rising. "And I'm not convinced there isn't more to investigate here." "Like what?" Chen challenged, her patience visibly wearing thin. Reynolds gestured vaguely at Harold's car. "Vehicle search." "I smelled something suspicious." A collective intake of breath came from the crowd. Harold, who had remained perfectly calm until now, finally showed a flash of anger in his eyes. "Officer Reynolds," he said, his deep voice carrying across the now silent parking lot. "You and I both know there's nothing suspicious in my vehicle. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I take only the medications prescribed by my VA doctor." "So you say," Reynolds retorted, "but I need to be sure you're not transporting anything illegal." "On what grounds?" Chen interjected sharply. "Probable cause," Reynolds shot back. "Erratic driving, nervous behavior." "That's absolutely false," Harold interrupted, his composure cracking slightly. "I have never driven erratically in my life. And what you're interpreting as nervousness is simply the pain in my knee from standing out here for 20 minutes. More phones had appeared in the growing crowd. A teenager on a bicycle stopped at the edge of the lot, filming openly now. "Sir, I need you to step aside while I search your vehicle," Reynolds insisted, purposely turning his back on Chen. Harold didn't move. "Officer, I don't consent to a search of my vehicle. There is no probable cause, and we both know it." Reynolds took a step closer, deliberately invading Harold's personal space. "You people always have something to hide, don't you?" The comment hung in the air like a thunderclap. Even Reynolds seemed momentarily taken aback by his own words. Officer Chen's eyes widened in shock. "Reynolds!" she hissed. "That's enough!" But Harold had straightened to his full height, something shifting in his bearing. Despite his age, in that moment, there was a hint of the commanding officer he had once been. "Young man," he said quietly, "I have served this country faithfully for 35 years. I have bled for the flag on your shoulder. I have watched good men and women of every color die defending what that uniform is supposed to represent. So when you say you people, I can only assume you mean decorated veterans who still believe in the Constitution." Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it. The crowd had gone completely silent. Chen stepped between them. "Mr. Johnson, you're free to go about your business. Reynolds, return to your vehicle immediately." Reynolds hesitated, then leaned in toward Harold. "This isn't over," he muttered, just loud enough for Harold and Chen to hear. "Officer Reynolds." Chen's voice was like a whip crack. "Car, now." As Reynolds stalked back to his patrol car, Diane Willis gently took Harold's arm. "Come on inside, Harold. Your blood pressure medication is waiting, and you look like you could use it right about now." Harold allowed himself to be led toward the pharmacy entrance, but his stride was noticeably stiffer, his jaw clenched tight against both physical and emotional pain. Inside, the pharmacy had gone unnaturally quiet. Customers pretended to browse the shelves while stealing glances at Harold. The teenager who'd been filming outside had followed them in. phone still raised until Willis fixed him with a stern look. "That was messed up," the kid said, finally lowering his device. "You okay, sir?" Harold nodded tiredly. "I'm fine. Thank you for your concern. My brother's in the army," the teenager continued. "He says they still teach soldiers about the Buffalo Soldiers and the Tuskegee Airmen and all that." "Were you one of them?" A small, sad smile crossed Harold's face. "No, son. I'm not quite that old. But I knew some of those men when I first enlisted. Giants. Every one of them." Willis guided Harold to the small waiting area near the prescription counter. "Sit down before you fall down, Harold." "I'm calling Robert." "Don't bother my son," Harold protested. "He's at work. And he'd have my hide if I didn't tell him what happened," Willis countered. Already dialing. Through the pharmacy windows, they could see Reynolds still sitting in his patrol car, hands gripping the steering wheel. Chen was standing beside the vehicle, her posture rigid as she spoke through the open window. "He'll be in trouble," Harold said quietly. "Good," Willis replied sharply. "He should be." Harold shook his head. "That solves nothing. That young man has something broken in him. Firing him just sends that brokenness somewhere else." The elderly woman sitting across from them in the waiting area snorted. "That's mighty forgiving of you, Colonel Johnson. If it were me, I'd want his badge." Harold looked surprised. "You know my rank?" "Everyone in town with any sense knows who you are," the woman replied. "My Theodore served under you in Desert Storm. Said you were the finest officer he ever knew." Harold looked down at his hands. Strong hands, now spotted with age but still steady. "That was a long time ago, Mrs. Baker. Not so long that people forgot," she insisted. "Not so long that it doesn't matter anymore." Outside, a police SUV with department markings pulled into the lot. Chief Paul Wilson stepped out, his expression grim as he approached Chen and Reynolds. The teenager had moved to the window, phone raised again. "Whoa, they called in the chief? This is going viral for sure." "Put that thing away," Willis scolded. "This isn't entertainment." Harold sat quietly watching the tableau outside. Reynolds was out of his car now, gesturing emphatically while the chief listened, arms crossed. Chen stood slightly apart, her posture making it clear whose side she was on. "Harold," Willis said gently, handing him his medications. "Robert's on his way. He wants you to wait here." Harold nodded, still watching the scene outside. "Been a long time since I was in the middle of a situation like this." "Like what?" asked the teenager, who had put his phone away but remained glued to the window. Harold's eyes were distant now, looking beyond the parking lot, beyond the years. "A situation where what you stand for matters more than who you are. Where the uniform has to answer for itself." He sighed deeply. "I had hoped those days were mostly behind us." The chief was looking toward the pharmacy now. Reynolds had gone silent, his earlier bravado replaced by the dawning realization that this incident wasn't going to simply disappear into the paperwork of a routine traffic stop. "They're coming in," the teenager announced. Harold straightened in his chair, wincing slightly as his knee protested. He adjusted his jacket, an unconscious gesture from decades of inspections and protocol. Whatever was coming next, Harold Johnson would meet it with the same dignity and courage that had carried him through wars both foreign and domestic. Through battles fought with weapons and with words. Some fights, he had learned long ago, weren't about winning or losing. They were about standing your ground when it mattered. And sometimes, standing your ground meant being exactly who you were, without apology or explanation, in a world that still wasn't always ready to see you clearly. Chief Paul Wilson entered the pharmacy with measured steps, his 30 years of law enforcement experience evident in his calm demeanor, despite the tension crackling through the air. Officer Chen followed close behind while Reynolds lingered near the doorway, his earlier confidence visibly deflated. The small waiting area fell silent. Harold remained seated, one hand resting on his bad knee, his expression carefully neutral as the chief approached. "Colonel Johnson," Chief Wilson said, extending his hand. "It's been a while." Harold rose slowly to shake the offered hand. "Chief, wish it were under better circumstances." The chief nodded grimly. "As do I." He glanced around at the onlookers, then back to Harold. "Is there somewhere we might speak privately?" Diane Willis stepped forward. "You can use my office, Chief." As Willis led them toward the back of the pharmacy, Harold's son Robert burst through the front door. At 45, Robert Johnson carried himself with the same dignified posture as his father, though his business suit replaced Harold's more casual attire. His eyes quickly found his father. "Dad, are you all right?" The concern in his voice was palpable. "I'm fine, son," Harold assured him, though the tightness around his eyes suggested otherwise. Robert turned toward Reynolds, who still hovered uncertainly by the entrance. "And you must be the officer involved." Reynolds straightened defensively. "I was conducting a routine traffic stop, sir." "Is that what we're calling it?" Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. As the city's deputy district attorney, his words carried extra weight. Chief Wilson intervened smoothly. "Mr. Johnson, we're just about to discuss the situation. Would you care to join us?" The teenager who had been filming earlier leaned toward his friend. "Dude, that's the DA's son. This cop is so busted." Willis ushered the group into her small office at the back of the pharmacy, closing the door on curious eyes. The chief remained standing while Harold lowered himself carefully into a chair. Robert took up position behind his father, one hand resting protectively on the older man's shoulder. "Officer Reynolds," the chief began, "would you please explain why you initiated contact with Colonel Johnson today?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "I observed a traffic violation. Illegal turn across a solid line on Maple Street." "That's false," Harold said quietly. "I made no such turn." The chief turned to Officer Chen. "Were you present for the initial stop?" "No, sir." I responded to Reynolds' call for backup. By the time I arrived, the colonel was already standing outside his vehicle. Chief Wilson nodded, then reached into his pocket and removed a small flash drive. "This was just delivered to the station by a concerned citizen. It contains dashcam footage from a vehicle that was behind Colonel Johnson's car from Pine Street all the way to this parking lot." He fixed Reynolds with a steady gaze. There was no illegal turn. Reynolds paled slightly but held his ground. "The footage must not show the full—" "It shows everything," the chief cut in, "including you following the colonel's vehicle for 6 blocks before activating your lights." Robert's grip tightened on his father's shoulder. "Sounds like targeted harassment to me." "Dad," Harold murmured, reaching up to pat his son's hand. "Let the chief handle this," Chief Wilson continued, his voice measured but firm. "Officer Reynolds, can you explain why your body camera was turned off during this stop?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "Technical malfunction, sir." "Convenient," Robert muttered. The chief ignored the comment. "And can you explain the comments reported by multiple witnesses? Comments that could be construed as racially motivated?" Reynolds looked at the floor. "I don't recall making any inappropriate comments, sir." "That's not what the recordings show," the chief replied. "We have at least 3 different civilian videos of the encounter." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "One of which clearly captures you using the phrase "you people." The small office fell silent. Outside, the regular business of the pharmacy continued in hushed tones, customers and staff alike aware of the drama unfolding behind the closed door. Harold cleared his throat. "Chief, if I may," Wilson nodded. "Of course, Colonel." "I've faced far worse than this young man's poor judgment," Harold said, his deep voice filling the small space. "What concerns me isn't what happened to me today. It's what happens to those who don't have a crowd of witnesses with camera phones, those who don't have a son in the DA's office." He looked directly at Reynolds. "Those who aren't recognized as a colonel before they're seen as a black man." Reynolds finally met Harold's gaze, a flash of defiance still visible beneath his discomfort. Chief Wilson pulled a chair closer to Harold. "Colonel, I understand your concern and I share it, but I need to address the immediate situation as well. Officer Reynolds' conduct today violated department policy at multiple points. There will be consequences. I'm not interested in ending this young man's career," Harold replied. "That solves nothing." Robert stepped forward. "Dad, with all due respect, that's not your call." "No," Harold agreed, "but my wishes should count for something." He turned back to the chief. "Paul, you and I have known each other a long time. Your father served under me in Korea." The chief nodded, a flash of something deeper than professional respect crossing his features. "He spoke of you often, said you saved his life and 20 others when you held that ridge against impossible odds." Officer Chen, who had been silent until now, looked between the two men with dawning recognition. "You're that Colonel Johnson? From the Chosin Reservoir?" Harold waved away the question with modest embarrassment. "Ancient history." Not to the families of those men who came home because of you, the chief replied quietly. Reynolds looked confused. I don't understand. What ridge? Robert gave a short, humorless laugh. Maybe if you'd bothered to check who you were harassing, Officer Reynolds, you'd know you were disrespecting one of the most decorated veterans in this state's history. The chief reached into his breast pocket and removed a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. He handed it to Reynolds. My father kept this his whole life. Read it. Reynolds unfolded the paper carefully. It was a front-page story from decades ago, showing a much younger Harold Johnson in full dress uniform, receiving the Distinguished Service Cross from a general. The headline read, Local hero receives nation's second highest military honor. As Reynolds read, his face changed. The article detailed Harold's actions during a brutal battle, how he had led a desperate defense that saved dozens of trapped American soldiers, carrying the last wounded man 3 miles through enemy territory despite being shot twice himself. When Reynolds looked up, the defiance had drained from his face. I didn't know. You weren't supposed to know, Harold said gently. That's not why I wear the uniform. Or wore it, rather. He leaned forward, wincing slightly as his knee protested. The point isn't who I am, son. The point is who I could have been. Any black man you stop could be a colonel, a doctor, a pastor, or just a good man trying to get his medicine. The uniform, yours not mine, is supposed to protect all of us equally. The pharmacy's intercom crackled to life. Diane, Channel 7 news van just pulled up outside, came the nervous voice of the assistant pharmacist. Chief Wilson sighed deeply. This is about to become very public very quickly. It already is, Robert said, holding up his phone. The videos are trending locally. It'll be statewide by dinner. Harold closed his eyes briefly, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. That's not what I wanted, Chen spoke up unexpectedly. Sir, if I may, perhaps this is exactly what's needed. Not for you, but for others. She glanced at Reynolds, then back to Harold. Sometimes change only happens when people can't look away. The door opened slightly and Willis peeked in. Harold, there's someone here asking for you. Says he's from the Veterans Association. Harold looked surprised. Already? How would they even know? Robert held up his phone again. Social media, Dad, your name is attached to the videos now. Someone recognized you. Outside, the news van had begun setting up. Through the pharmacy windows, they could see a small crowd gathering, including several older men in VFW caps who had apparently just arrived. Colonel, the chief said quietly, I can try to contain this, get you out the back way if you'd prefer. Harold looked at the faces around him, the contrite Reynolds, the earnest Chen, his protective son, the concerned chief. Beyond them, through the window, he could see the gathering crowd, the cameras, the veterans standing at parade rest as if awaiting inspection. After a long moment, Harold Johnson straightened his shoulders and rose to his feet, ignoring the pain in his knee. No, Paul, I think Officer Chen is right. Maybe this needs to happen. He turned to Reynolds. And maybe you need to be part of it. Not as the villain in this story, but as someone who can learn from it. Reynolds looked up, surprise evident on his face. Sir? We all have our moments of truth, son, Harold said. This one belongs to both of us. The question is what we do with it. As Harold moved toward the door, Robert stepped forward to support his father's elbow. Dad, are you sure about this? Harold nodded, his expression resolute. I didn't stand up on that ridge in Korea to hide in a pharmacy stockroom 50 years later. A small smile touched his lips. Besides, if your mother were here, she'd expect me to handle this with dignity. That she would, Robert agreed, his own expression softening at the mention of his late mother. Harold turned to the chief. Well, Paul, shall we go address this situation? As they moved toward the pharmacy entrance, the afternoon sun caught something on Harold's jacket that had been hidden before, a small, unassuming pin that Officer Reynolds hadn't noticed during the traffic stop. It was the kind of detail that might mean nothing to a casual observer, but spoke volumes to those who recognized it. It was the quiet symbol of a man who had faced fear and prejudice before, who had bled for his country even when that country didn't fully embrace him, who had commanded respect through actions rather than demands. And as they stepped outside to face the cameras and questions, that small pin caught the sunlight again, the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest military decoration, worn not with pride or boastfulness, but as a simple reminder of duties fulfilled and promises kept. The pharmacy door swung open, and a wave of camera flashes greeted Harold as he stepped outside. The small crowd that had gathered earlier had swelled to nearly 50 people. The local news crew adjusted their equipment while the reporter, a young woman with a determined expression, pushed forward. "Colonel Johnson, can you tell us what happened here today?" she called, microphone extended. Harold paused, his hand still resting lightly on his son's arm for support. The afternoon sun highlighted the deep lines on his face, lines earned through decades of service, struggle, and quiet dignity. Behind him stood Chief Wilson, Officer Chen, and a visibly uncomfortable Officer Reynolds. "Just a misunderstanding," Harold replied calmly, his deep voice carrying across the now hushed parking lot. The reporter pressed on. "Witnesses say you were racially profiled and harassed by a police officer during a routine traffic stop. Is that accurate?" Before Harold could answer, 3 elderly men in veterans' caps approached. The tallest of them, a white-haired man with a slight limp, stepped forward and saluted sharply. "Colonel Johnson, sir. James Patterson, 2nd Battalion, Korea. The boys and I came as soon as we heard." Harold returned the salute reflexively, military bearing momentarily replacing his weariness. "At ease, Patterson. This isn't a battlefield." "Begging your pardon, sir, but in some ways it is," Patterson replied, lowering his hand. "Different kind of war, same old fight," the crowd murmured in agreement. Chief Wilson stepped forward, raising his hands for quiet. "Folks, I understand you have questions and concerns. I want to assure everyone that the department takes this incident very seriously. We're conducting a full investigation. We've seen those investigations before," someone called from the crowd. "Nothing ever changes." Robert Johnson moved to stand beside the chief. "As Deputy DA, I can promise you this case will receive proper attention." His voice carried the weight of legal authority, but also the personal investment of a son protecting his father. The reporter turned her microphone toward Officer Reynolds, who stood slightly apart from the others. "Officer, do you have any comment on the allegations of racial profiling during your stop of Colonel Johnson?" Reynolds looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Chief Wilson started to intervene, but Harold raised his hand. "Let him speak," Harold said quietly. "He deserves that much." All eyes turned to Reynolds. The young officer straightened, swallowing hard before meeting the camera's unforgiving eye. He began, then faltered. He looked at Harold, then back at the crowd. "I made assumptions today that were wrong. I treated a distinguished veteran with disrespect." He paused, visibly struggling. "I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air, simple but inadequate. Some in the crowd nodded grudgingly. Others shook their heads in dismissal. Harold stepped forward, his movements deliberate as he navigated around his bad knee. "May I say something?" The reporter immediately turned her attention back to him. "Of course, Colonel." Harold looked out at the faces before him, young and old, black and white, angry and curious and concerned. His gaze lingered briefly on a group of teenagers recording everything on their phones, then moved to the veterans standing at respectful attention, and finally to the ordinary townspeople who had stopped their daily routines to witness this moment. "What happened today isn't just about me and Officer Reynolds," he began, his voice strong despite his fatigue. "It's about patterns and practices that have gone on too long. It's about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't, who gets seen as a threat and who doesn't." He gestured toward the Distinguished Service Cross pin on his jacket. "I spent 35 years serving this country, led men and women of every background into battle, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that bullets don't care about the color of your skin. Neither does courage or honor or sacrifice." Harold turned slightly to include Reynolds in his gaze. "This young officer made a mistake today, a serious one, but firing him doesn't solve the larger problem. It just moves it somewhere else." "So what's your solution, Colonel?" the reporter asked. Harold smiled slightly. "I've never been one for speeches. I'm more interested in actions. And I think that's what we need now. Specific actions that lead to real change." He looked directly at Chief Wilson. "The chief and I will be discussing some ideas about community oversight, training reforms, and accountability measures. And I'll be volunteering my time to help implement them." Chief Wilson nodded solemnly. "Colonel Johnson has my word that this incident will lead to meaningful reforms in our department." From the back of the crowd, a middle-aged black woman called out, "And what about my boy who got pulled over 3 times last month just driving to his night classes? Who speaks for him?" Harold met her eyes. I do, ma'am. We all should. That's why this can't end today with just one officer's apology. It has to be the beginning of something bigger. As if on cue, 2 more news vans pulled into the parking lot. Robert leaned closer to his father. Dad, this is getting bigger by the minute. Maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. Harold shook his head. No, son. Too many of these conversations happen behind closed doors. That's part of the problem. The group of veterans moved closer, forming a protective semicircle around Harold. Patterson spoke up again. Colonel's right. We've been quiet too long about how some of our brothers get treated when they take off the uniform. Officer Chen, who had been observing silently, stepped forward. Chief, with your permission, I'd like to be part of whatever reform committee the colonel is suggesting. Reynolds, after a moment's hesitation, joined her. Me too, sir. When the others looked at him in surprise, he added, If you'll have me. I think I need to learn. The gesture wasn't lost on the crowd. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the first step toward something constructive. A call from the back of the crowd. Town hall meeting. Let's get this all out in the open. Chief Wilson nodded. I think that's an excellent idea. We can schedule something at the community center this week. The local diner owner pushed forward with a tray of water bottles. Meanwhile, let's get the colonel out of this heat. He's been standing here long enough. As the crowd began to disperse, forming smaller discussion groups across the parking lot, Harold finally allowed himself to be guided toward a bench in the shade. His son sat beside him, while Chief Wilson knelt to speak more privately. This could be the wake-up call our department needed, the chief admitted, but it shouldn't have come at your expense, Harold. Harold sipped the water someone had handed him. Few worthwhile changes come without cost. Paul, you know that as well as I do. Across the lot, Reynolds was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Officer Chen and a group of community members, including the woman who had spoken about her son. Look at that, Harold remarked quietly. He's listening. Really listening. Robert followed his father's gaze. One officer having one conversation doesn't fix systemic problems. No, Harold agreed, but it's where healing starts. Person to person. By evening, the videos of the incident had spread far beyond their small town. Harold's phone rang constantly. Old military colleagues, civil rights organizations, even the governor's office. Each time he answered with the same patient dignity, emphasizing the need for constructive action over recrimination. At the station, Chief Wilson had called an emergency meeting of all department personnel. The dashcam footage played on the briefing room screen, along with clips from the civilian videos. Some officers looked away in embarrassment. Others watched with grim determination. This stops now, the chief concluded after laying out immediate policy changes. Not because we got caught, not because it went viral, but because it's wrong, and we're better than this. As darkness fell, Harold sat on his front porch, finally home after the longest pharmacy trip of his life. Robert had wanted to stay, but Harold insisted he return to his family. Some battles you fight with others, he'd told his son. Some you need to process alone. The evening news played softly from the living room television. Harold's phone lit up with a text message from an unknown number. Colonel, this is Mike Reynolds. I know an apology isn't enough, but I want you to know I can't stop thinking about what you said today, about seeing people clearly. I'd like to learn how to do that better if you're willing to teach me. Harold looked at the message for a long time, his weathered fingers hovering over the screen. Then with deliberate care he typed his reply. Monday, 0900, Veterans Center on Pine Street. We'll start there. He set the phone down and gazed up at the stars, thinking about all the men and women he'd led over the decades, the battles fought on foreign soil and on American streets, the progress made and lost and made again. Change would come, Harold thought. Not as quickly as some hoped or as completely as others feared, but it would come, conversation by conversation, policy by policy, heart by heart, and he would do his part as he always had, standing tall despite the pain, moving forward one step at a time. 6 months had passed since the incident at the pharmacy parking lot. Autumn had turned to winter and then to spring, bringing with it the sense of renewal that had come to characterize the small town's journey over the past half-year. The community center buzzed with activity as people filed in for the monthly police oversight committee meeting. What had begun as a tense town hall in the aftermath of the Confrontation had evolved into a structured form where citizens and officers worked together on meaningful reforms. Harold Johnson sat at the front table, papers neatly arranged before him. At 72, he still maintained the organizational habits of his military years. Beside him sat Chief Wilson and 3 community representatives elected by the town council. The audience seats were nearly full. Attendance had dipped somewhat from the emotional first meetings, but a core group of dedicated citizens remained committed to the process. "Let's begin," Harold said, his deep voice easily carrying across the room without the microphone. "Officer Reynolds, would you like to present your report?" Mike Reynolds stepped forward, no longer the defensive young officer from 6 months ago. His posture remained straight, but the aggressive edge had softened into something more thoughtful. "Thank you, Colonel," he began. "As you know, we've been piloting the new community engagement program for 3 months now. Each officer has been paired with a local resident for regular ride-alongs and feedback sessions." He gestured to a chart on the wall. "We've seen a 63% increase in positive interactions reported by community members, especially in neighborhoods that historically had tense relationships with law enforcement." An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. "That sounds nice on paper, but my grandson still says he feels nervous when a patrol car follows him home from his night job." Reynolds nodded. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Taylor. Numbers don't tell the whole story. That's why we've added the anonymous feedback option on the department website. Every report gets reviewed by this committee, not just by internal affairs." Harold watched Reynolds handle the question with a patience that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Their Monday morning meetings at the Veterans Center had started awkwardly. Reynolds defensive, Harold reserved. But over cups of black coffee and amid the quiet dignity of the center's walls lined with photos of local veterans, something had shifted. "I never told you why I became a cop," Reynolds had confessed during their 3rd meeting. "My uncle was mugged walking home from work when I was 12. Nobody helped him. Not even the people who saw it happen. I wanted to be different. To help," Harold had nodded. "Good intentions can get twisted when they're not examined regularly. That's true in war, and it's true in peacetime too." Now, 6 months later, Reynolds had become an unexpected ally in the reform effort, facing down resistance from older officers and skepticism from community members with equal determination. The meeting continued with updates on the new de-escalation training program, body camera compliance rates, and the newly implemented civilian complaint process. When they reached the final agenda item, Chief Wilson took the floor. "As you know, the State Police Academy invited Colonel Johnson to address the incoming cadet class last month about community relations." The chief smiled at Harold. "I think we all want to hear how that went." Harold adjusted his glasses. "It was an eye-opening experience. For them and for me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I spoke to 93 cadets from across the state. Diverse group, more so than in my day. I didn't lecture them about what they were doing wrong. Instead, I shared stories." He looked out at the attentive faces before him. "I told them about my first day in basic training, when a drill sergeant couldn't see past the color of my skin to the soldier I could become. About the time my unit was surrounded in Korea, and how we survived because we trusted each other despite our differences. About coming home to a country that still had separate water fountains despite the uniform I wore." Reynolds nodded almost imperceptibly. He'd heard these stories during their Monday meetings, had come to understand how they'd shaped the man Harold had become. "And then," Harold continued, "I invited Officer Reynolds to join me at the podium." A murmur ran through the audience. This hadn't been in the planned presentation. Mike told them about our first encounter, didn't sugarcoat it or make excuses. Then he talked about what he's learned since, about seeing people as individuals first, not threats or statistics. Harold's weathered face creased in a smile. "I think the cadets learned more from his honesty than from all my war stories." After the meeting adjourned, people gathered in small groups, continuing discussions as they had come to do after these monthly sessions. Harold eased himself into a more comfortable chair, his knee still troubling him in damp weather. A young woman approached, notebook in hand. "Colonel Johnson? I'm from the university paper. I'm doing a feature on community policing initiatives, and yours has become something of a model for other towns. Would you have time for a few questions?" Harold gestured to the chair beside him. "Of course. What do you think has been the key to making these reforms stick?" she asked. Most initiatives like this lose steam after a few months. Harold considered the question. Across the room, he could see Reynolds deep in conversation with Mrs. Taylor, whose grandson had been stopped repeatedly before the reforms. Relationships, Harold answered finally. Papers and policies matter, but they're just words without trust between people. We started by making everyone uncomfortable. Officers had to hear hard truths from citizens, and citizens had to see officers as humans capable of change. And Officer Reynolds? She prompted. Many people thought you should have pressed charges against him. Instead, you've worked closely together for months. Why? Through the window, Harold could see the new community garden that had been planted on a vacant lot across from the police station, another initiative born from their reform efforts. Officers and residents worked side by side there each week, growing food for the local food pantry. Punishment is easy, Harold said. Reconciliation is harder but heals more completely. He watched as Reynolds helped Mrs. Taylor with her coat. That young man had the courage to confront his own biases. That's rare and valuable. Later that evening, as the sunset painted the town in soft orange light, Harold sat on his porch steps, waiting. The rumble of a motorcycle announced his expected visitor. Reynolds pulled up, removing his helmet as he approached. In his hand was a small paper bag. Brought those seedlings I mentioned. Thought your tomato garden could use some variety. Harold accepted the offering with a nod. Just in time. Ground's finally warm enough. He gestured to the second chair. Coffee's still hot. As they settled into what had become a comfortable routine, Harold's son Robert pulled into the driveway. He greeted Reynolds with a handshake, a significant evolution from their first tense encounter. How'd the meeting go? Robert asked, joining them on the porch. Progress, Harold replied simply. Slow but steady. Robert nodded, having come to respect his father's patient approach even when his prosecutor's instinct pushed for faster justice. Got some news today. Governor's office called. They want to use our oversight model as a template for a statewide program. They're asking if you'd consult. Harold raised an eyebrow. Both of us, he said, glancing at Reynolds. Or no deal. Reynolds looked surprised. Colonel, that should be your project. You've earned it. This was never about me, Harold replied. It's about what happens after I'm gone. The next generation needs to see that change is possible. He looked between the young officer and his son. They need to see that reconciliation doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means building something better from its lessons. As darkness settled over the town, the three men talked about next steps, new challenges, and the work still to be done. No one pretended the journey was complete, or that one town's efforts could erase centuries of complicated history. But on this spring evening, with the scent of new growth in the air and the sound of neighborhood children playing freely in the distance, Harold Johnson allowed himself to feel something that had become increasingly familiar over these past 6 months. Hope. Not the bright, flashy optimism of youth, but the weathered, resilient hope of a man who had seen humanity at its worst and its best, and still believed in the possibility of change. One conversation, one relationship, one community at a time. More coffee? Harold asked, rising carefully to his feet. Yes, sir, Reynolds replied. And then maybe you can tell Robert about that cadet who asked about your medals. Harold chuckled. Good stories are worth retelling. He paused at the door, looking back at the two younger men. One his son by birth, the other connected by a bond forged in the crucible of conflict and reconciliation. Almost as worth retelling as they are worth living,